In 1963, I was drafted. My basic training was at Fort Knox. It was November 1963. I was on KP duty on the day of JFK's funeral. Fort Knox was filled to capacity. Barracks were being used that hadn't been used since the Korean War. After Fort Knox, I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. My assignment was Officers Candidate School. But I discovered that in order to go to Officers Candidate School, I had to re-enlist. I informed the officer in charge that I had no plans of staying in the service beyond 2 years. I was assigned to a artillery unit. My AIT training, Advanced Individual Training, was in artillery. We thought we were going to Germany. We were told we were going to Germany. But then after the completion of our training, we were told we were going to Fort Benning, Georgia. At Fort Benning, Georgia, I was assigned to 11th Field Artillery, 197th Infantry Brigade. We were an artillery unit on infantry base. The main functions of Fort Benning was airborne training and the creation of the first air assault, or the creation and training of the first air assault. Being a support unit, we were given all kinds of crazy assignments. I had gone to chemical biological warfare school at the Warrior College, which gave me a certificate. One of our crazy assignments was testing gas masks. We were assigned to a group, mostly infantrymen, to test gas masks so that they could be worn for many hours at a time without removing the mask. The mask had a tube that ran from the mouth down to your canteen, and minerals and vitamins were dissolved in water, and you could drink this during the day. We were forced marched from base camp 5 or 6 miles out to a field, and there we would run around and do silly things. On these forced marches, it was very, very hot. You could see the heat rising from the asphalt as we marched through the Georgia woods. Halfway there, they would give us a break, and we would smoke a cigarette or so. On one particular day, when the officers called for us to get back into line, the men from my unit refused to get up. They lit a second cigarette. They were angry. These were guys from the south side of Chicago and the west side of Philadelphia. They were angry. They had reason to be angry. One of the things they hadn't redesigned these masks at all. These masks were from the Korean War, and there were no drain holes in the eyes, so that when you marched in sweat, the sweat would accumulate in the eyepiece until the eyepiece was half filled and you had briny salt water in your eyes. They were given the second command to get in line, first by a second lieutenant, and then by a captain, and then by a major, who said that if they didn't get up, they would be charged with mutiny. They reluctantly got up and got in line, and we marched out to the fields. When we got back to the barracks later in the day, I knew these guys were going to be in real deep trouble the next day, so I decided to go see the adjutant general. Through chain of command, enlisted men can file complaints at the adjutant general's office. So I had to go through chain of command before I got there. I had to seek out my second lieutenants that were in charge of the group I worked for. Then the captain in charge of my battery, and then the colonel in charge of my battalion. Each one told me to go back to the barracks and forget it or I was going to get into trouble. But I kept going. When I got to the colonel's office, I was informed by the sergeant major that the colonel was not in his office. Instead, a major came and said that I could wait in his office until the colonel got there. So we sat in his office and talked, and I had promised myself to remain invisible while I was in the service, not to say much, not to do much, serve my time and get out. The major must have been a good interrogator because I began to compare what we were doing to what the Nazis did during the Second World War. That the Pentagon was using us as experimental guinea pigs. They were testing their equipment on civilian soldiers. And most of us were civilian soldiers. Civilian soldiers being men who were drafted as opposed to men who enlisted in the service. He listened. After I was finished with my little spiel, he said, "Go back to your barracks and forget this. That's my strong advice to you, just to go back to your barracks and forget this." I said, "No, I've come this far. I'm not backing down. I had to file a complaint." He said, "Well, the colonel's been here, so wait here and I'll go tell him that you're going to see him." So about 2 minutes later, he comes back. He takes me into the colonel's office, and the colonel is angry. There's steam coming from his ears. His face is red. He starts insulting my parents for raising such a bastard. He goes on, calling me names and trying to make me angry, and I just stand there. Finally, he gets up and he leaves the office in a rush, and he tells the sergeant major that he's going home, and that goddamn private who's supposed to be a soldier can do whatever the fuck he pleases. So there I stand. I know I have to follow through on this now. I have to go to the main base and file my complaint. So I walk to main base, and I have no idea where the adjutant general's office is. So I wander around, and I finally find a little building saying adjutant general's office. I go in. There's a sergeant. I tell him that I'm there to lodge a complaint, thinking I'm going to see a general, or at least an officer. Instead, they give me a sergeant. I tell the sergeant the story, and he starts in turn telling me his own story about being tested for malaria in the Panama Canal. So I didn't expect much to happen, and I left and went back to the barracks knowing that I was in deep, deep trouble. The next day we report, we march out again, and this time there are vehicles driving around, big black sedan vehicles with stars on them. So there was at least one general that was out there looking at what we were doing. They ended the test that day. They were over. I, however, was on a list. A list that eventually put me on orders to Vietnam. Another day in the life of Harold.